party. Good morning, everyone. Everybody have a good time last night?
Yes.
Am I loud enough?
Yes.
Wow. The people had a really good time, I guess, aren't here. But so thank you guys for coming. We wanted to have this session at 5 a.m., but pushed it back.
Hey everybody, thank you for being here in this early morning. This is, I say it each year, this is one of my favorite sessions of both days. And to my insurance partners out there, these are guys who are in the front lines talking about how you actually detect and mitigate and stop some of the threats that you guys are insuring. All right, to my far side, all the way down there, Mr. Ty Lambo with Cloud E-Assurance. Ty's one of our good partners. We're focused with him on really trying to educate your customers about cloud risk, so he'll be going into some of that. Right next to him is Jim Savoy with Carnegie Mellon, one of the, of course, leaders in studying cyber risk. We're trying to do some things with those guys. Liz Townsend, right next to him. She's going to wow us with encryption today. Tremendous company in our Heroes Club for all things encryption. And next to her is Jag Baines. Jag's, I feel, is one of the best speakers. We continue to ask you back because you kill it, Jag. So it's always great. He talks about denial of service and how you really stop those guys in their tracks. And then we got the great Joe Loomis with Cyber Response. Has very, very interesting solutions I want you guys to hear about. And then my great friend for 20 years, Brad Gallup from Dorrance. Brad?
All right, thanks very much, Mark. And thank you for getting out of bed for our 8 a.m. early bird session, Technology to Mitigate Risk. Looking over the Net Diligence agenda, this is one of the few conference sessions that doesn't feature underwriters, brokers, and lawyers, but real-life technologists. Folks that are developing the latest solutions that companies are or should be using to protect their networks. We've had, over the past couple of months, some extraordinarily large breaches announced. And these are only the breaches that have been publicized, or worse, only the breaches that companies running these compromised networks know about. Those of us on the insurance side have been waiting for a number of years for the cyber insurance line to really reach critical mass. Unfortunately, it looks like the cyber underworld has beaten us to the punch, with organized teams operating with either the tacit blessing or hard financial support of their governments. Their attacks on our networks are sophisticated and they are relentless. It's not an easy time at all to be a Chief Information Security Officer. Those who have been in the space a while realize how extraordinarily difficult it is to keep a modern corporate network secure. You can have mainframe computers, hundreds of servers, thousands of desktops, maybe some point-of-sale terminals, and all the mobile devices to worry about. You've got many dozens of distinct applications, including SaaS-type models and tools like Salesforce and SAP, driving certain internal functions. You've got third-party service providers on the network with access to systems and sensitive data. And these could be cloud providers with all the other cloud concerns involved as well. And finally, hundreds or thousands of employees to worry about, any of which could be tempted to click on that embedded link before they've had their second cup of coffee. Add to that the reality of the CISO's life. Your function doesn't produce revenue, so it's tough to get a lot of budget. Your network is constantly in flux with equipment, software, and people coming on and offline, and you've got a threat environment that's changing constantly. The only certainty is that if something bad happens, they're going to be looking at you. So Mark and Dave Chatfield have been talking for years about how information security is a matter of managing people, processes, and technology. The technology piece is arguably the most important leg of the stool when it comes to reducing risk of intrusion and data loss. So Mark's done the introductions. Let's get right to it. Joe Loomis, starting from a macro level, for years companies have been trying to lock down their networks, often using internal teams and often operating in a vacuum. How have you seen things change over the past few years?
A lot of militarization is going on right now. Specifically, if you see the engagement of government and how more proactive they are to helping these organizations with publishing these frameworks, like DHS is critical infrastructure, and then you have the NIST framework that's coming out. I know Carnegie does a lot of work with the US CERT team. Those frameworks are really foundational, documents that almost every organization should be aware of, and at least be familiar with how they what their purpose is. It's no longer let's look on the internet for a policy and then adopt it. It's really every environment is unique in itself, and it has to be run literally like a battalion, like a military operation. Because if your adversary is the same type of well-minded, well-orchestrated, well-funded organization, you're not going to defend against an enemy of that type of character and sophistication if you don't respond with the same type of one-to-one type of capability. So it starts really with the foundational stuff. I've seen people start to adopt these new standards. There's a lot more contribution. There's more buzz. Back in the day, they used to say NIST was just kind of a piece of paper, a waste of time. But now it's becoming more relevant. It's becoming more practical. It's no longer just this hypothetical best practices. No one ever really adopts to it. But I still would like to see more adoption. And I think the government's involvement of trying to ask for more commercial feedback from these breaches to learn what we can do to be better, I think is on the horizon.
Jim, with your work at CERT, what do you see happening in terms of how companies are preparing the foundations of their information security work?
So just to echo on the comments there, this notion of applying frameworks that are being made available. Government's investing significant resources in things like the NIST framework, like standards, data sharing. There are across a number of the sectors of what we call the critical infrastructure. There are organizations called information sharing and analysis centers. Those are very good resources where we bring together government, industry, and in some cases academia to share information about emerging threats, about what's working and what's not working in terms of response. I think one of the fundamental sort of mental shifts that is slowly starting to happen is this notion that you can't anymore make the assertion that we've done everything that we need to do so we're protected. You can't assume that you're not going to be attacked. It's more, you've got to have a balance between being able to protect, being able to detect when you are attacked, because it is going to happen, and then being able to properly respond. And then that gets into, you talked about a parallel to like a military operation, right? Operational training, things like having incident response plans that have the correct stakeholders involved, your counsel, your forensics people, if you're using an outside forensics firm, your insurance carrier, having things like exercises, even at a tabletop level, to go through and kind of parallel response, much like organizations do for response to like a physical disaster.
So much of it on the corporate side, has to do with baking process into how you manage information security. This morning, Jim and Ty were talking a little bit about CMMI, which was frankly new to me. Could either of you just take 2 minutes, explain in very broad terms what it is and how it can help an organization improve?
Okay, thanks, Brian. So just for full disclosure, Jim actually invented CMMI. I just practice it. So CMMI, for those who may not be aware, is basically just a maturity model. So it allows you to go beyond compliance, right? So a lot of companies tend to focus on compliance, and you can be 100% compliant to whatever a control set. Could be PCI, could be ISO, could be NIST. But if you're not mature as an organization, you're going to find out the hard way that, you know, you need to improve, right? So CMMI basically allows you to improve your processes. So on a scale of 1 to 5, some people actually like to say you can be at a 0. But I feel that if you're locking your doors, if you're closing your windows, you're probably at a 1. You know, so from a maturity level scale of 1 to 5, CMMI allows you to measure process maturity, because that's really what's lacking in the security industry. You know, a lot of companies focus more on compliance, and compliance is not the be-all, end-all. It's kind of the minimum requirements at the starting point. So I say, you know, it's sort of going from point A to point B being compliance, but CMMI actually allows you to get to point C, point D, point E. So and what we find with a lot of, especially very large organizations, is that the more mature you are, the more security becomes part of your culture. So it pretty much becomes baked into the way you do things. And that's one of the things CMMI allows you to measure. So it's really a measurement tool and a process improvement tool.
Thanks, Ty. Much appreciated. Moving from process to kind of hard technology. A lot of the underwriters in the room spend a lot of time talking about encryption. And typically, years ago, encryption was a very complex implementation. It gummed up your system, it slowed down your processing, it took a lot of power. Liz, what traditionally prevented companies from implementing effective encryption technologies, and how's that improved?
Right, so this is a really good question. CMMI is actually a new concept to me, but I think it's a really important one just because compliance is a low bar across most industries. You know, you can talk about, you know, in PCI or in HIPAA, you know, HIPAA doesn't necessarily say you have to encrypt, but if you do have a data breach and you're not encrypting and you're not using standards-based encryption, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Across the bar, you do have to actually go above and beyond if you do want to be secure, and there's a lot of different ways to interpret what meeting compliance is, depending on what industry you're in. But backing up, yes, encryption has a long history of having a reputation that it's difficult and costly. And this is one of the reasons it has been slow to adopt, is that 10 years ago, doing an encryption project was actually incredibly difficult. You had to have very specific development projects. Proof of concepts would take months, if not, 12 months, or longer to complete. You'd have to buy and implement extremely expensive hardware that often your encryption key management vendor would have to fly out and install into your IT infrastructure. Today, that just actually doesn't hold true. A lot of these key management vendors and encryption vendors have moved their technology to the cloud, and that's really brought down cost and complexity. Complexity overall has just come down, so it makes so much more sense now to try to implement encryption and key management. That's not me. Same ringtone. So that is one reason why there's still a lot of inertia for companies to adopt encryption key management. Another really important reason why it's slow to adopt is education, and sometimes just ignorance. Sometimes willful ignorance. Willful ignorance is a really big problem. There's that notion out there that, oh, it'll never happen to me, or I'll just pay a fine. And as we see with some of these larger data breaches, I'll just pay the fine doesn't really hold up and pan out very well as a risk mitigation method. For smaller businesses, the I'll just pay the fine method of dealing with the data breach can shut down your business forever, which is a pretty scary idea. In terms of education, I think it comes down to educating the executives that you're working with to be able to ask the right questions. I would say a lot of the executives, running mid-level enterprise organizations today. You know, we're in business school 10, 20 years ago, and when they were learning about GRC, they learned how to ask the right questions about financial risk and business risk, whereas the technology field today and protecting data as an asset that you have to protect as part of governance is fairly new. So I think a lot of business leaders just don't really know how to have that conversation with their security teams and their IT teams. They'll have a conversation and they'll ask questions like, are we secure? And when they ask vague, tepid questions like that, they're going to get vague, tepid answers like, yeah, we're secure, but don't worry about it, we've got it covered. But really they need to learn how to ask questions like, can I get an itemized list of all of the locations of our sensitive data and the specific way in which we're protecting each of those sets of data? And they also have to know, what is sensitive data? It's no longer just credit card numbers and social security numbers. It extends now beyond into email addresses and home addresses and phone numbers. The JP Morgan Chase data breach, that was all loyalty data, and that's considered, personally identifiable data. That data leads to extensive phishing scams, and that also needs to be protected.
Liz, keeping you in the hot seat for a little bit longer. Following the Dexter class malware attacks like Backdoor that have affected Target and Home Depot, what have you seen the desire to adopt better encryption from a point of sales system standpoint increase?
Yeah, so anytime there's a data breach, anytime a company has a data breach, they will rapidly adopt encryption. Because that is the first question people ask when there's a data breach and the data is unencrypted. They'll say, why wasn't it encrypted? Why weren't you doing this? Right, and it's not necessarily that they weren't doing encryption at all, but it's typically that they weren't doing encryption in an in-depth way at every single point where the data was exposed. There are inherent security risks and points in payment systems where data is exposed, which is why companies are moving to chip and pin technology, because there are some areas there that you can't completely fill those holes of payment systems. But overall, payment systems are complex, different. They're made up of different sort of complex pieces. So you have the terminal where you swipe your card, you have the payment application software that's in the register, you have your back-end systems where all that data goes, for backups, and those aren't necessarily cohesive technologies. Sometimes you'll get technologies that are made by the same people and they talk to each other well, but typically they aren't coming from the same vendors. So you have to look at each point where that data is going and figure out how to encrypt it and make sure it's encrypted at each of those points where it's vulnerable, where you can encrypt it.
Terrific, thank you. We'll be touching in a couple minutes on cloud technology and encryption in the cloud. Before we do so, Chad, the underwriters in the room are selling a lot more business interruption coverage, and denial of service attacks are a large reason why. How have the nature of these attacks changed over the past 2 or 3 years? Who's launching them, and what are their motivations?
Everyone's launching this. The nature of DDoS is that it's a very easy thing to do. So just to backtrack here, but DDoS comes in many forms and form factors. You have the standard volumetric ones, which people typically understand, like massive tidal waves and bandwidth. But lately we've seen a lot more application layer, more sophisticated attacks. These are targeting specific parts. I'll focus on the website DDoS because that's where most of the activity occurs. But yeah, so lately we've been seeing a lot more sophistication at the application layer, where you don't need as much resources or bandwidth. With a few crafted packets, you can bring a site down. So we're seeing a lot of activity in that level. And it speaks to the ingenuity of the DDoS attackers of today. Traditionally, there was always an underlying assumption that the attackers were just doing it for kicks. That's not the case. These guys are motivated. They're financially motivated. They're getting paid. They know what's at stake in bringing a site down. You know, an e-commerce site obviously losing revenue opportunities with the site just being brought down. But also you could lose brand awareness along your site's down. Your customers will go to your competitor's website. And your SEO may start dropping as well. So there's obviously a lot of stake, and the people who understand this and know how to they can make a living out of this, right? So, and what's especially pernicious is that it's actually fairly easy to do. So the attacks are coming, they're myriad, they come from everywhere. The attackers they're international. There's no real one area that you can say is attackers are strictly from Russia. That's not the case.
Yeah, but you say they can make a living at it. How are they making a living at it?
Blackmail. They're getting paid under the table. There's a underground economy for these types of things. Blackmail and extortion is still one of the more common methods. We see a lot of customers coming in who are being extorted. So that's probably the most common methodology. But competitors who want to take down their competition's website, they'll go find something under the radar.
That sounds good, Mark. I think we can work on the advising site later on. How does the technology typically work to stop a DDoS attack?
There's a couple. Let's go through the most popular counters. Standard tactic is to buy hardware. The big iron strategy is what I call it. Just try to buy a massive firewall, and then put it in front of your enterprise network, and hopefully it'll take care of it. It can work. It can be very situational, especially as DDoS attacks are getting more sophisticated. Are they going to be able to keep up with the latest evolutions? But that's probably the most common methodology. It certainly fits in with a lot of the requirements from frameworks like this and PCI and all this about buying a firewall. But when it comes to DDoS, I'm not sure if it's a very effective strategy. Again, staying focused on just websites. Another standard response to DDoS is using a content delivery network, where you put your site on with a company like Akamai and broadcast it from thousands of nodes. The intention here is to maximize the surface area to absorb the DDoS attack. Works against, again, the traditional style DDoS attacks, but with the newer style attacks, application layer level, where attackers have done the reconnaissance, they know where the weak elements of your website are, they'll simply go through those CDNs and then take down the origin server and bring your site down. And finally, probably the area that's probably getting the most growth or uptake is where we are, cloud DDoS protection services. We're focused on just providing DDoS protection, nothing else. We're not hosting CDN or anything like that. And with a very lightweight application to the end customer, we can interject ourselves between the would-be attackers and the customer solution.
Terrific. Thanks very much. Those who attended the cloud session yesterday saw, it was an Ali's slide with the adoption of cloud technology. Obviously, the cloud adoption of the technology is typically seen as a double-edged sword. I think in some instances, cloud service providers can protect data far better than a small or medium-sized organization can protect it themselves. Ty, what do you see as the key differentiators between the main commercial cloud service providers and where they're weak? In many cases, we see the cloud model as a low-cost provider. What do you see as the key weaknesses among the low-cost providers?
So, first of all, I'd like to talk about the benefits of cloud. So some of us that attended yesterday's session may have gone away thinking, I'll never move into the cloud or jump into the cloud. I actually have a completely different perspective, right? So, for 5 years, I kept telling my customers, don't move to the cloud. We're still trying to secure the perimeter, right? Don't move to the cloud. And I suddenly realized that it was too late. Most of our customers were already major cloud service providers, or they were already using cloud massively, right? So I just really felt it was a losing battle, a lost battle. So my focus right now is actually helping, kind of empowering all the different cloud stakeholders, whether it's the cloud service providers, the auditors, the brokers, the cloud customers themselves, to jump into the cloud safely and securely. I think that's, cloud is inevitable. The cost is just, the cost benefit is just so massive that you just cannot ignore it. So low cost is one of the benefits. There's no doubt low cost. But when I think low cost, I think don't use free cloud services. I wouldn't recommend it, right? You get what you pay for, right? So I don't mean zero cost. I mean low cost, relatively inexpensive. Vinny, my good friend Vinny, actually mentioned elastic waistband, rapid elasticity, I think is a big benefit of cloud. We actually launched a SaaS application in less than 6 months with a shoestring budget by leveraging the cloud. 10 years ago, we would have spent 10 times the amount, even as a small software company. So I mean, the benefits are just too compelling, right? Cost, rapid elasticity and massive scalability. You could set up a website, that handles 1,000 visitors a day or 1 million visitors a day by leveraging cloud technology. It's just too compelling, right? And you could do it at a fraction of the price. Having said that, I mean, if you don't ask the right questions, you end up paying more later on. If there's a breach, you end up paying more, the headache, the reputational loss, the legal, liability, depending on whether it's PII or EPHI that got breached. So I think the benefits are great. In terms of gaps, we actually publish an independent study every quarter called the Top 10 Cloud Service Providers. So we've looked at about 100 major cloud service providers, and we've looked at their overall security program and what they've put out in the public domain in terms of their security program. And what we actually found is that there are cloud service providers that just don't care about security. They actually blatantly tell you, we're not responsible for anything. Put the data in our infrastructure. If you read the SLA, they don't guarantee anything. And then you also have cloud service providers that actually pride themselves on taking security seriously. So if I'm trying to move my infrastructure or my data to the cloud, and I'm security conscious, because I'm a security company, I'm going to gravitate towards the ones that actually take security seriously, at least the ones that can spell security, right? So what we've actually found is that even amongst the top 10 cloud service providers, we found about we basically call it the top 10 gaps. And I'll share the first 3 with you. So last quarter, we actually found the first one was user access management. So a lot of the cloud service providers, even the top ones, were allowing users to set up weak passwords. They weren't enforcing strong passwords. iCloud, the Apple iCloud product, not meaning to pick on Apple, was actually one of them, right? So, and we know what happened, right? 100 plus celebrities had their naked pictures stolen and published online, right? So for this quarter, what we actually found, actually for Q3, we found that resiliency was actually the #1 gap. Some of the top 10 cloud service providers basically had data centers in areas that were prone to earthquake, hurricanes, and other types of natural disaster. So from a business continuity standpoint, from a disaster recovery standpoint, if you're using any one of those cloud service providers, you need to be aware that they do have these gaps, right? There could be a major earthquake in, somewhere where you have a very high concentration of data centers, right? I'm not going to mention anywhere in particular. And think about the implication, right? User access management is still a gap. So the way they enforce strong passwords, the way they credential or, I guess, onboard users, had some holes, which the bad guys could exploit. We also found that not all the top cloud service providers were supporting multi-factor authentication, such as secure ID, two-factor, other types of two-factor authentication. And then the third weakness we found was in the area of data governance. A lot of the CSPs did not have DLP products, data loss prevention products, which is it's a bit challenging, right? Because half of the time they don't see the data, right? They're pretty much hosting the data. They're allowing you to kind of, you're sharing space, with other tenants. So that's a bit challenging, and I think the DLP technology or market hasn't really matured enough to be able to focus on the cloud service provider space. So that's a gap. That's a gap that we feel obviously the bad guys could exploit. So I started out with kind of the benefits, and then the bad news is even if you're using the top 10 cloud service providers based on our ratings, you still have to be. There are things that you still have cause for concern.
Joe, when you're working with your clients, they're going to be to different extents dependent on clouds. What kind of coaching do you provide?
Really know your partners, right? There's two different types of security that we can talk about in regards to these compliance standards and PCI. Is internal and external security. So cloud providers are audited currently by how they protect their data internally. They're not audited against how do they protect their customers' data externally. So what I mean by that is that they might have internal controls like, let's look at like Amazon, not to pick on anybody. They've got very big sophistication internally of how they run their organization. But from an outsider, from a customer's perspective, what does Amazon do or other cloud providers Azure to protect their end customer? So if you buy a server from Amazon, a VM, and you put it up there, are they hardening it? Are they eliminating these user controls? Do they have these type of controls in place? And I think you'll find that there's a huge gap from the perception of what security is internally, what perception is of security externally is. For example, there's a CISO gentleman around here named with a company called Firehost that is really trying to define that, to try to match the external security to be the equivalent of secure of the internal security. So be audited against the same standard so that they can say, okay, we're hardening the OS, we're hardening the user access control, we're providing encryption methods. So that, it's not just this perception, I'm working with a big company, they've got really good sophisticated security. It's now, what are you really doing to help me besides just giving me a VM? I think understanding that is you're going to see who you pick. And that's personally why we even use a secure cloud provider for our technology, because based on their controls, they could do it so much more in a mature fashion than we could ever do it. For the amount of sophistication that they have, the investment, and also their client base, the proof's in the pudding. And see who's there and then who's audited. And then back to risk mitigation, I was just thinking of this, I wrote a couple notes when we were talking about encryption, is from a claims perspective, because I know the audience is pretty targeted into risk and managing of risk and understanding risk. I challenge everybody, if you ever really want to understand how mature an organization is, you could ask them literally 5 or 6 questions that you'll know if they really got their stuff together or not. And those questions could be as simple of, when was the last time you ran a simulation or a tabletop exercise, and what were the results? What's the number of your bodies in your organization that are dedicated to security compared to the number of open recs? You can start to see if there's a load balance there, like a really big gap. When was the last time that they were pen tested? And where is that letter of attestation? Who did it? And I'd like to see the results of that. Any of the policies that they have, are they adopted to any of the current frameworks? And the last thing is when was the last time you had any employee training? If you ask all those questions, you'll be able to get a pretty good feel of if they're sophisticated or not, or if there's because let's be honest, it used to be a checkbox questionnaire, asking somebody about, hey, do you have an incident response plan? Check. And it just went down a list, and that was risk, and that's how you measured it. Well, it's a lot more dynamic now than the checkbox world that we used to live in. And from my perspective, I'm seeing a lot of security operations teams very understaffed because it's this huge, huge demand. And the supply with Carnegie and all these universities trying to build these curriculum to try to create these factories of cyber analysts. There's not enough, just not to scare everybody in the room, but if you took every hospital that needs a SOC, that needs the required manpower. There isn't enough analysts in the community alone just to supply healthcare. And then you take the rest of the world, what are they doing? So you're dealing with a lot of undermanned, under-resourced type environments where that's part of the huge risk. Is human error is one of our biggest adversaries. Is there's not enough people to manage the amount of threat, and that's why I believe moving the community towards automation and sophistication of technology and how you respond to automated attacks with DDoS providers. You have to get to automation. If you're fighting a botnet that's got sophistication and automation that will just spin your wheels, there's not a human being group out there that could keep up with the machine. I mean, we're talking about going up against IBM's Big Blue, and it's just not even, we're not even there. Why even bother? Why try to throw bodies at the problem when this is a technology problem? And so that's where my passion lies.
Your tick box approach, you described perfectly a cyber insurance application. So thank you.
Yeah, I would just add on to that. Beyond looking for proof of commitment to provable compliance, so looking for those PCI letters of attestation. AWS has done this. It's gone through its own internal PCI audit. Our company partners with a hosting company to provide sort of an offsite HSL location for folks who want hardware but don't have their own internal IT infrastructure. They have also gone through the same PCI audits, looking for, does the cloud have, does it offer virtual private clouds? Do they publish, their SOC 2, SOC 3? Do they have those things? Have they made them public? Can you look it up? Can you see? Beyond that, there is very clear language written out there by PCI and by the Cloud Security Alliance that says, and I think this is a really important thing to remember, just because your cloud is compliant doesn't mean you're compliant, and vice versa. Just because you're compliant doesn't mean your cloud is compliant. So you have to really work with the technology that your company is using, and you have to work with, what kind of compliance you're getting getting from your cloud provider, and make sure that you're compliant on all fronts. And you should be working with your QSA auditor to really make sure you're meeting all of those checkboxes.
It's terrific, thank you, Jim. From a critical, you're approaching the world from a much different place with your positions in certain kind of development. From a critical infrastructure perspective, what are your main concerns around everybody kind of moving operations onto the cloud?
So certainly there are concerns about the critical infrastructure. Some large percentage, the figure varies depending on what source you look at, between 85 and 90% in the United States of what we consider the critical infrastructure, things like the power grid, the water system, telecom, is under private ownership. But yet government has an interest in ensuring that these things are resilient, that we have power, we have clean water, telecom networks stay functioning. So there are concerns on both sides in the critical infrastructure, in that you have things that were put in place often a long time ago, systems that were designed sort of in a different context of being standalone, or systems that were intended to operate for many, many years and really kind of operate as a black box and not be touched. Now you have, particularly we're seeing this like in the electricity sector, things like the smart grid, technologies being brought online, which carries with it benefits, but also opens up a whole new paradigm in the equipment. The underlying infrastructure was never designed with this connectivity in mind. So there are certainly there are concerns there, and then I think from a process standpoint, we've talked about the people in process technology, and that kind of relates to needing this balance between protect, detect, and respond. And I think that one of the key things here is detect, right? So we're seeing a lot of, for example, Verizon puts out the data breach investigation report each year, and in full disclosure, my organization's a contributor to that report. But one of their findings each year is that the majority of organizations that suffer a breach learn about the breach from somebody else. They don't detect it themselves. It's picked up by law enforcement, it's picked up by customers. We actually did some work with an organization that I'm not going to identify, that a very large organization suffered a breach of their employee database, basically their HR records, okay, which is, and they're not an HR firm, right? This was just their internal management of their large number of employees. They learned about the breach several months after it happened, early in the next calendar year, when their employees went to file their tax returns and were reporting that a large number of their employees were reporting, the IRS is telling me that I already filed my tax return and somebody claimed my refund. It's like, what's going on? So there's a massive identity theft, people opening credit cards, and so that's how the organization found out about it, not through their own internal monitoring. Even in the, we've had the very large, highly publicized breaches involving the retail sector, the payment card terminal. You get Target, you get Home Depot. In the Target case, for example, I mean, this has all been publicly reported. There were multiple opportunities within their system to catch that. There were alerts thrown that were not properly actioned. There were systems in place that could have automatically deleted that malware. They were still being tuned and set up, so they were basically in a learning mode. And then you have the issues, I think it applies kind of broadly in critical infrastructure, issues of complexity. In the Target case, it's pretty clear that nobody fully understood the complete architecture of how you get from an entry point involving a small heating and ventilation contractor that had some very limited, or was supposed to be some very limited remote access to submit invoices for work that he did. How you trace a path from there all the way through the system to embedding malware on the actual payment terminal devices into stores, right? There's sufficient complexity that nobody understood that you could actually draw that path. The attacker figured a way to do it and evade detection at the same time.
Thanks very much. Kind of marrying two themes. I don't know who wants to tackle it first, but companies utilizing cloud technology are now able to encrypt that data before it goes into the cloud, or utilize cloud services that manage the data for them on an encrypted basis. There are a couple different approaches to it. What, Liz or Ty, what do you feel is, first of all, what's being adopted more commonly, and what do you think the superior methodology is?
I'm not sure quite what the right answer is to what's being adopted most commonly. You can bring your own encryption to the cloud, or you can use your cloud service provider. Most of the top-tier cloud service providers are all providing standards-based encryption, AES encryption, RSA encryption, and that's all good. You can absolutely use the encryption provided by your cloud. In our thinking, the way we deal with encryption in the cloud is it's not it doesn't really come down to is the encryption effective. It comes down to how are you managing your encryption keys, and will your cloud service provider allow you to bring your own keys to the cloud. So you can encrypt data in the cloud and let your cloud service provider manage your key, but you're assuming some pretty high risks there. So just so that everybody knows, when you encrypt data, it creates an encryption key, and that key is used to encrypt and decrypt the data. Doing encryption, we like to say, is only half of the solution. If you're not protecting your encryption key, then you're not protecting your data. One of the biggest mistakes companies make is they'll be collecting databases of credit card numbers, social security numbers, loyalty data. They'll encrypt it, and then automatically with whatever encryption solution they're using, the key will just get stored into the database, often just right at the bottom of the file. This can happen in the cloud as well. So if anybody gains access to that data, it doesn't matter if it's encrypted, they've got the key, they can just decrypt it. So what you really need to do is pay attention to how you're managing your encryption keys in the cloud. You can use your own virtual private cloud key management solution. Amazon offers a key management solution that uses HSMs, and I think it's pretty costly, pretty expensive to do that with them. But if you are allowing your cloud provider to manage your encryption key, they can do whatever they want with it. The NSA knocks on their door tomorrow and says, hey, we want that company's data, give us their encryption key. They have no responsibility to tell you, they can just hand it over. So if you're concerned with a data breach, if you're concerned with being in complete control of your data, you really need to look at the other side of the coin, which is key management in the cloud, which is actually pretty easy to do now. A lot of vendors have moved their key management technology which is based on standards, FIPS and NIST, FIPS 140-2 standards, to the cloud. You can't, there's actually no actual standard for an encryption key management virtual server in the cloud. That standard just doesn't exist yet. So what people are doing is moving that technology, which is based on a hardware module that has met that standard, moving it to the cloud. So that's how we see people should
Thanks, Liz. Ty, has it gotten to the point where cloud encryption is a best practice? How often is it being adopted?
Absolutely, it is. The only challenge is not a lot of cloud providers actually provide encryption, right? So it's typically like an add-on. I wouldn't personally trust my cloud service provider to manage my keys, right? Just in case they get hacked, right? Then. But one thing I agree with Liz. Key management is very, I always say it's very key, no pun intended. But one thing I've seen in the past 10 years is the encryption technology itself has really matured. But I remember when I used to be kind of the divisional CISO for a company that printed checks for 5,000 banks. And my responsibility was protecting 100 million records on our mainframe. And we actually had developers that had log files with your bank account details, some of you in the room, stored in log files, text files. So we had to encrypt all our hard drives. And I remember having a discussion, it's kind of a debate with the IT guys, because they wanted to use, the encryption key would have been the local admin password on every build, every laptop build. And the password, I'm not going to tell you what it is, but you could probably guess it in a second. And so we had this debate for like a whole month while they were setting up this project about not using the same password as the local admin password as the encryption password. And eventually they made it a little bit more complicated, but the weakness we had there was just the key management. The keys were stored locally. So if somebody lost a laptop, there was no way to recover the key. But it was a very immature market at the time. There were probably maybe 2 or 3 companies that did hard drive encryption. 10 years later, obviously the market is a lot more mature. Now we have this cloud thing. So I think the decision most people have to make is, am I going to go with client-side encryption, where the keys are stored by me, nobody else has access to the key, or am I going to trust my provider or a third party to manage the keys? So that's called server-side encryption. So it's either client-side or server-side. So I think that's something I personally would recommend the client-side, because it kind of gives you full control. But don't make the encryption key password.
Or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah. All right, we've got a couple minutes left, so what we'll do, we'll move down the panel on a speed round. Joe, starting with you, what new process or technology do you feel is absolutely essential for a a company to be adopted or looking at and adopting now or over the next year or two?
Excluding mine, no shameless plug. I would say move towards automation, right? Because if the security team is understaffed and undermanned, throwing bodies at the problem is not going to solve anything. It really isn't. It's just going to create more chaos and more voices and more discoverable content and more admissions of guilt and all the other problems the lawyers deal with when you're dealing with very frantic, stressed out security analysts. Automation of technologies, and what I mean by automation is I don't know how many people in the room has ever attended like an RSA or a Black Hat conference. You could see rows and rows and rows of technology. And you have to ask yourself and wonder, if I was a new company, and let's just say day one I'm a $1 billion company, and I want all the best in the breed of all the coolest technology out there to protect my company. First of all, who's going to connect all those tools together? Because right now what the big disconnect in the security community is that it's very siloed, right? You've got the FireEyes, you've got the SIM tools, which are the log management tools, you've got encryption agents, you've got Endpoint, which is like the new antivirus for malware, it's like anti-malware. And so all these tools are out there, and they've got some APIs, and they're trying to figure out how to all play together and how to work well together. And that's the big hurdle, is it's very expensive to not just buy the tools, but then also get the tools to all play well together. Because you're dealing with a lot of different cultures, you're dealing with a lot of different technology stacks. And if you buy 20 tools and you have 20 consoles you have to log into, and you only have 3 or 5 people in the security team, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. It's like you're literally just, you have a rotational, you're just spinning in your chair, looking at different, screens every day, and you're not really, addressing the problem. And then imagine having to do that every day, all day, on every single threat. I mean, one of the gentlemen I was at dinner last night said that, the number of times that their company is attacked every day is almost a billion potential penetration attacks. So you have to ask yourself, if you've got 5, 10, 20, even 50 people in a security team, and they're all logging in all these consoles, how are they ever going to keep up with potentially, or even keeping even a grasp understanding? And that's partially why you see a lot of these retailers being compromised, because the sheer number of threats are so big that they just become numb to whenever something looks fishy. Like if you see fishy all day, it's no longer really fishy. It's like the new normal. It's like, I don't see that every day. That's not really that big a deal. They're always looking for something different, anomalies, right? And that's part of the reason why it went under the radar with some of these big retailers, is because they noticed it, but it just, went ignored. So that's my speed round, is automation is everything.
Automation, okay, Jack?
This is not a revelation, but make a playbook. Quite often we come across CMOs or strategic IT decision makers, and they're trying to munge one solution to fit 3 different security initiatives. For example, DDoS is not data theft, but yet they buy a platform that's supposed to address both. I'd instruct them to look at the overall IT infrastructure, see what strategies, see what points of entry exist, what you want to protect, and make it a separate game plan for each type of initiative. Data theft, hacking, DDoS, encryption, they're all separate. They need to be tackled separately. But quite often people try to marry these initiatives and put it under one solution. Automation is great, but if you fundamentally don't know where the boundaries lie between these various solutions, you're not going to adequately protect it.
Okay, automation, game plan, Liz?
Yeah, I agree with all these. When you're designing a preventative defense in depth data security solution, you have to look at multiple different elements, from access prevention to encryption. I would say encryption is only a part of the solution, but it's a really, really big part. And teaching, if you're an attorney, you're working with, executives and clients, teaching them how to sort of helping them to educate them and teach them how to ask the right questions is really critical. One story I like to use is Adobe had a data breach a couple years ago, last year, maybe 2 years ago, of encrypted data, and that story completely went away. We don't hear about Adobe anymore. That story is gone. The Target data breach is going to stick around for a long, long time. So if you are a company and you have a data breach, you want to be Adobe. You don't want to be living a story where, you know, oh, I just lost 56 million credit card numbers. They were unencrypted. Now my chief security officer is gone. I'm the executive, and now I'm out of a job. That's not the story you want to live. So education and encrypt.
Encrypt, okay, Jim?
Okay, so like kind of teed up very nicely. Thank you all for that. So we talked about like 1 billion attack attempts, on a regular basis. We talked about increasing complexity, huge amounts of tools, large amounts of records, managing encryption keys. All of this is about, but yet there's not enough security staff in the world to manage all this stuff. So it's really about how do we prioritize what needs to happen. I think the way you do that is by building a process where you can have conversations between technical folks and management and senior management, executive level folks around treating the data as a critical asset in the organization, and then understanding in business terms, which usually means dollars and cents, not bits and bytes, what's the impact if that particular data were to be compromised? What's the impact of the organization? And then can we use that as a place to start in terms of prioritizing where we want to invest in more tools, more resources, more automation, bringing in automation to like offload some of the data collection and using the expensive human capital to do analysis and prioritization. To
Terrific. Ty, let me guess, cloud security.
Oh, security as a whole. So I think we need to all kind of approach, I think my co-panelists probably alluded to this in their comments, but we have to approach security more from a more holistic, right? People, process, technology. I think there's a very strong focus on technology, but if you don't have the right people, enough people, which typically happens in most IT shops or security shops, you're going to be left behind. So it's people, process, technology. But I'll say that there needs to be a strong emphasis on having mature processes, right? Because once security becomes part of your culture, then it's easier to kind of stay ahead of the bad guys, or at least be at the same level as them. The other thought is compliance is not equal security. I think we're finding out the hard way that just checking the box and saying, I'm PCI compliant, I'm ISO, I'm NIST, isn't enough. We have to continuously improve. And whether it's cloud, whether it's enterprise, 10 years time it may be called Sky, who knows, maybe not cloud. We need to be prepared, irrespective of technology, the business model, the same principles apply, continual improvement.
Thanks very much, Ty. Regrettably, it appears we've run out of time. Please give our panel a big hand.